Good evening, everyone.
It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Matthew J. Franck. Matt brings decades of distinguished scholarship and teaching to the study of American politics, constitutional law, and political philosophy. He earned his bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, from Virginia Wesley College in 1980 and his master's and doctorate in political science from Northern Illinois University. His academic career spans more than 3 decades. Matt joined Radford University in Virginia in 1989, where he taught constitutional law, American politics, and political philosophy. Chaired the Department of Political Science for 15 years and was recognized with the university's Foundation Award for Creative Scholarship. He has also taught at Marquette and Southern Illinois universities. Served as a Fulbright Professor for American Studies at Yonsei University in Seoul and held fellowships at the Heritage Foundation and Princeton University's James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, where he later served as the Associate Director. Matt is currently Senior Fellow at the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, visiting lecturer in politics at Princeton University and Professor Emeritus at Radford. His writings appear regularly in National Review, First Things, Public Discourse, and the Wall Street Journal, among many other publications. And he is the author or editor of works published by University Press of Kansas, Cambridge University Press, and Oxford University Press, among others. We are especially fortunate tonight because Matt is not only a renowned scholar, he is one of our own. A fellow parishioner, a brother knight of Columbus, and a lector in our parish who proclaims God's word with eloquence and reverence. He brings everything he does a faith that is very much alive in our community. That combination of deep scholarly experience and lived Catholic faith makes Matt Franck the perfect person to share his thoughts on why we, as Catholics, should celebrate America's 250th birthday. We are grateful for his time with us this evening. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming Matt Franck.
Thank you, Genesius, for that very kind introduction. Everybody hear me okay? Yes. Okay. And I want to thank the Adult Faith Formation team, which invited me to speak this evening. I've spoken for them before, but not for several years. So it's very nice to be back with my fellow parishioners. At every meeting of our Knights of Columbus Council here at St. Gregory the Great, we begin with 2 ceremonial recitations. First a prayer, then the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag. From their beginnings, the Knights have been both a Catholic and a patriotic fraternal order. The choice of Columbus's name was a deliberate one, intended to honor the Catholic discoverer of the Americas and to signal to our fellow citizens, who likewise honored Columbus, that we Catholics were no less American than they are. In 1882, when the Knights were founded, the problem of anti-Catholic prejudice on the part of the Protestant majority was a very real one, and Knights of Columbus was a reply to that. One part historical pleading, one part proud defiance. But in 2026, my title, Why Catholics Should Celebrate America's 250th Birthday, may seem strange. Is there anyone who thinks Catholics shouldn't celebrate the 250th birthday of our country's founding in 1776? Anyone, that is, who believes that Catholic faith and American patriotism are incompatible with each other? Well, I'm here to say that there are such people on both the left and the right. On the left, there are secularists and progressives who lean heavily on a reading of America's founding principles as Enlightenment ideas, products of the age of reason. For them, the emblematic figure of the American founding has always been Thomas Jefferson, or at least he was the emblematic figure until his reputation was tarnished by the charge that he had fathered children by one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. who was herself the half-sister of Jefferson's late wife, Martha, they having a father in common who did the very thing most historians now think Jefferson did too. Our view of Jefferson is very mixed now compared to half a century ago when I began college. Yet if his ideas can be separated from his alleged deeds, those ideas remain at the heart of the secular Enlightenment reading of our founding. That reading is simply this, that America's novus ordo seclorum, new order of the ages, had, quote, burst the chains of monkish ignorance, in Thomas Jefferson's own colorful expression. Church and state were to have a wall of separation between them. Jefferson again. Human reason, not ancient dogmas, was to govern human affairs. Everyone's conscience would be free to pursue happiness as each sees fit by the pure light of reason. In 1822, Jefferson wrote a letter in which he said, "I trust that there is not a young man now living in the U.S. who will not die an Unitarian, that is, as a fully deistic rationalist, shedding the trappings of the Trinity in miracles and sacraments." This prediction, needless to say, did not come to pass. Yet in the 2 centuries since Jefferson wrote those words, the secularist left has continued to believe that progress means the death of biblical religion, and that this is the true working out of the Enlightenment for which Jefferson spoke, and that they see embedded in our founding as a country. On the right, a strange mirror image emerges. Here we find critics and adversaries of Enlightenment thought, including Catholic ones, who take essentially the same view of a fundamental opposition between Christian faith and Enlightenment liberalism, but take the side of Christianity against the American founding. One prominent example would be Notre Dame political science professor Patrick Deneen, who describes the principles that undergird the American founding as a, quote, war against nature, end quote, a rejection, in Deneen's view, of everything that ancient philosophy and the church had taught Western man about virtue and the purposes of political life. For Deneen, every particle of the decadence that afflicts us today, the radical individualism, the degeneration of liberty into license, the soulless consumerism, the authoritarian state that tramples virtue and religion underfoot, all of that is traceable to the choices of the American founders in adopting the political doctrines that came to be known as liberalism. Classical liberalism, I'm speaking of course. From this point of view, from Deneen, or the sort of the Catholic right point of view, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence is an occasion for mourning, not for celebration. One may say that if both the secularists of the left and the traditionalists of the right are correct about the conflict between the American founding's Enlightenment liberalism and the teachings of the Christian faith, at least the traditionalists are choosing the right alternative in the opposition. But they're both wrong. There is no fundamental incompatibility. The founders of our country, Jefferson's idiosyncrasies notwithstanding, saw none. And they were correct, neither should we. What then is a better reading of our founding, especially of the Declaration of Independence, whose quarter millennium birthday we celebrate this year? The Declaration was a group product, a statement of the Continental Congress of 1776, whose members included Anglicans, Unitarians, Quakers, Baptists, Presbyterians, including the lone ordained minister at the Congress, John Witherspoon of Princeton, and one Catholic, Charles Carroll of Maryland. The document drafted by Jefferson and revised by the Congress referred to God 4 times. First, in the opening paragraph's reference to the laws of nature and of nature's God. Second, in the core statement of the Revolution's principles, which said human beings are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Third, in an appeal near the end to the supreme judge of the world to recognize the justice of the Revolution. And fourth and last, in a closing pledge that declared the signers' firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Thus we have in this one brief document, we have God as lawgiver, God as creator of the world and of the human race, God as judge of our actions, and God as the protector of those with justice on their side. This is an active God, not a mere watchmaker who wound up the world and let it go. This is the God who reveals himself in Scripture. Where else would people learn of these attributes? And I have not mentioned yet, but will now, the wellspring principle from which everything flows in the Declaration. The first of the truths held to be self-evident, even before we are told of our endowment with unalienable rights. What's that first self-evident truth? That all men are created equal. Created. There's that creator God implied already. More importantly, the equal dignity of all human beings as creatures of one creator is the foundation of all our political principles. America and the West in general owe this idea to the church, that man is imago Dei, made in the image of God. Male and female he created them, says the book of Genesis. For all the wisdom and virtue we might derive from the classical inheritance of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, there is nothing like this teaching of equal human dignity, until the truths about the human person, taught first to the Jews by the God of Abraham and Moses, are universalized with the incarnation and carried by the apostles in the Great Commission to the Gentiles as well. To compress 2 millennia of civilization into a few words, no Christianity, then no dignity for women or for children or for the unborn. No sacramental character to lifelong marriage. No abolition of slavery. No moral crusade against racial bigotry. No universal human rights transcending race and culture. No Christianity, none of those things. And certainly no American Revolution. No liberalism in the classical meaning of that term, referring to the principles of a free society. A state limited in power, governing in justice and representing the people, honoring the conscience of everyone, making a free space in society for the voluntary actions of individuals and families in their churches, their economic enterprises, their creativity and education in propagating ideas. None of that happens without the church and its legacy. The liberalism of the American founding is not simply the working out of one great thinker's ideas, say of the Englishman John Locke, for all his undeniable influence. It is instead an amalgam, a compound of modern political theories, of Locke, yes, also of Algernon Sidney, of Montesquieu, and of the English common law inheritance, the government of laws, not of men, as taught by Lord Coke and Sir William Blackstone. An amalgam as well of lessons from ancient republicanism, the histories of Greece and Rome, the philosophies of Aristotle and Cicero, and finally, unquestionably, of ancient Christian teachings too. The Imago Dei, the Golden Rule, the 10 Commandments, the love of neighbor, the Sermon on the Mount, the parables of the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan, the distinction between the things of God and the things of Caesar. As more than one scholar has shown, the most frequently cited work by far in political writings in the period of the Revolution and the founding was the Bible. To this, a gimlet-eyed and skeptical Catholic might reply, yes, fine, but isn't the Christian element in the American founding distinctively Protestant? And weren't the Protestants of that day distinctively anti-Catholic? My answer to that is a yes and a no. Yes, the Christianity of the American founding is predominantly Protestant. But no, that founding is not in principle anti-Catholic. Here we must distinguish between principles and prejudices. Catholics in America have often been on the receiving end of bigotry, an ugly streak of American nativism that crested in the 19th century when waves of Catholic immigrants arrived on these shores. First the Irish and the Germans before the Civil War, then the Italians, Poles, Slovaks, and others afterward. But our best response to prejudice from our Protestant fellow citizens who wanted to claim Americanism for themselves alone has never been to respond in kind or to shelter in Catholic ghettos and feel excluded. It has been instead to claim our rightful place in the community on principle. We have reminded our fellow Americans that there is nothing in our country's founding principles that a Catholic cannot affirm as much as any other Christian. Abraham Lincoln knew this well. He abhorred anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant sentiment, and he said in 1858 that immigrants who attached themselves to the principles of the Declaration were, in his words, blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that Declaration. It is also important to remind ourselves that Catholics were not latecomers to the American Party, but were there at the beginning. While Catholics became a significant proportion of the US population only in the second quarter of the 19th century, and we took until 1900 to become the single largest church in America, we, Catholics, were here in small numbers but with disproportionate influence from early colonial days. I'm referring to the Maryland colony. I want to say a little bit about that because perhaps there are things you don't know about it, things I didn't know until recently. Created by a charter granted to the Catholic nobleman George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, in 1632, and subsequently to his son Cecilius Calvert, who was the first so-called proprietor of Maryland, the colony was not in fact named for the Virgin Mary, but for Queen Henrietta Maria, the French Catholic wife of King Charles I of England. Just as the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a Puritan refuge, Maryland became a refuge of sorts for English Catholics in the 17th century, and was a mission field for the Jesuits, who were the first priests in the colony for many years. Though Catholics were never a majority in the colony, they nonetheless substantially controlled the politics of Maryland for several decades in the 17th century, due to the authority of the Calverts as proprietors and governors, and to the power of the great landowners who were seated in the colonial assembly, who were overwhelmingly wealthy Catholics. The Catholics of Maryland held power until what English history calls the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, which in England was an almost bloodless coup that swept the Catholic King James II from the throne and replaced him with his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her Dutch husband, William. You recognize those names, William and Mary. To abbreviate the impact of that event in Maryland, here's what happened. The colony's original charter was not long afterwards suspended. In 1692, a new Protestant majority in the Maryland Assembly effectively made the Church of England the established church. And in 1704, the public celebration of the Catholic Mass was forbidden by law. You could have masses only in private chapels, but not in churches purpose-built for the Mass. During these years as well, Catholics were barred from public office in Maryland, from the practice of law, and even from militia service, although they were graciously permitted to keep their arms. They were disadvantaged in these and other ways until the American Revolution, some 8 decades later. They were not hunted as fugitives from the law. They were not treated as, for instance, Edmund Campion had been treated under Queen Elizabeth. But they went from being the favored elite in Maryland to being a beleaguered minority. And they were barred, as I said, from officially serving the colony that they had founded. But that rapid sketch of history skipped over a signal event that occurred during the Catholic heyday of the mid-17th century. The Maryland colony, when the Catholics ran it, was the first community in America to enact a law protecting freedom of conscience for every sect of Christianity. The demographics of the colony made this at least prudent. Catholic elite governing Protestant majority. And there were features of the law that we would say today violate the freedom of speech. People could be fined, for instance, for saying insulting things about other people's churches. But the 1649 Act Concerning Religion, as it was called, nevertheless laid down a very American marker for genuine religious freedom that was the first of its kind in this country and far in advance of anything similar in Great Britain. After the Protestant takeover of Maryland some 4 and 5 decades later, at the turn of the 18th century, Protestant Catholic relations blew hot and cold over the decades prior to the Revolution. For the most part, the Catholics of Maryland kept the faith under trying conditions, although a few became Anglicans under duress. Events both in and beyond the American colonies had an impact on the lives of Maryland Catholics and their status with their Protestant neighbors, such as the 1745 Jacobite Rising in Scotland that attempted to put a Catholic Stuart back on the British throne, or the French and Indian War, which lasted in this country for 9 years. It was known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, but it started here first and lasted here from 1754 to 1763, pitting Britain and her colonies against a Catholic power, France. And the Quebec Act of 1774, by which Britain tolerated Catholicism in the French-Canadian province that it had won in that war. This, by the way, the Quebec Act, even merited an oblique mention in the complaints listed in the Declaration of Independence against the Crown 2 years later. But as Mara Jane Farrelly concludes in her book Papist Patriots, which I recommend and from which I have taken the foregoing history of Maryland, when the revolutionary crisis came in the 1770s, her words now, Farrelly's words, Maryland Catholics were the colonists most prepared to accept the cultural and psychological implications of independence from England. Whether in or out of power in the colony they had founded, she argues, the Catholic community had been, in her words, self-consciously defining itself for several generations as distinctively American. That is, suspicious of the British government, opposed to its established church, dedicated to liberty, and especially attached to religious freedom. And the fervor of the revolution proved to be incompatible with religious rivalry and prejudice. In a revealing sign of progress, the first governor of Maryland, under its new post-independence state constitution, a constitution that restored the religious freedom first enacted by the Catholics in 1649, the first governor under that constitution was a Catholic convert, Thomas Sim Lee, who was actually a cousin of the Lees of Virginia. In the period of the Revolution and the founding, by far the leading Catholic family in Maryland was the Carrolls, originally hailing from Ireland, not England. John Carroll, trained in Europe to be a Jesuit priest, became the first bishop in the new United States, and he founded Georgetown University as well. John's cousin Charles Carroll, probably the wealthiest man in America at that time, signed the Declaration of Independence on behalf of Maryland, and Bishop John's elder brother Daniel Carroll, signed the Constitution. Charles, who was later one of Maryland's first senators, died in 1832 at age 95 as the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence. He outlived Jefferson by 6 years. Daniel Carroll, who was one of the state's first members of the House of Representatives, was also one of the first commissioners of the District of Columbia, responsible for supervising the design of the nation's capital. All three of these Carrolls, John, Charles, and Daniel, were on good terms with fellow patriots from other states, including George Washington. In fact, Washington, not one of the era's greatest thinkers, but certainly its greatest statesman, is a bellwether of sorts. Watch what Washington does, watch his behavior, and you see a model of the emerging American character. As early as 1774, when serving as a delegate of Virginia to the First Continental Congress, Washington attended a Catholic Mass in Philadelphia in the spirit of ecumenism. He did so again during the Constitutional Convention in 1787. While commanding the Continental Army during the Revolution and desiring to draw sympathizers to the American cause among the French Catholics of Canada, Washington in 1775 wrote an order to the army banning the celebration among the troops of Guy Fawkes Day. If you don't know what Guy Fawkes Day is, it's an anti-Catholic British holiday still celebrated in some circles in England on November 5th, which commemorates the foiled attempt by a handful of English Catholics to blow up the Parliament during a state appearance of King James I in 1605. Also in March 1780, upon hearing news of resistance to British authority in Ireland, General Washington gave the troops a holiday for St. Patrick's Day celebrations. And lest we forget, Catholic France, once our foe when we were a colony fighting with Britain in the French and Indian War, Catholic France now came to the aid of the American Revolution, and their aid was pivotal. Washington would never forget how indispensable France's army and navy were to our independence. Many Americans know of George Washington's famous letter as the new president to the Jewish congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. All my Jewish friends know it really well. In this public letter of August 1790, Washington told his Jewish readers, and it was an open letter, it was published, so he was telling everyone, that America is not a land of mere toleration, where some people's religious faith is practiced at the indulgence of others. No, he said, it is a land where liberty of conscience is enjoyed by all as one of their, Washington's phrase now, inherent natural rights. But this was not the only such letter by the first president. Many of the leaders of America's minority religions had written congratulatory, open public letters to Washington when he became president. The Jews did, the Baptists, and also the Catholics. John Carroll, now the country's first bishop, was joined by fellow priests and Catholic laymen in addressing such a letter to Washington. And the president replied to them, too, in March 1790. Here is some of his closing. Quote, as mankind become more liberal, they will be more apt to allow that all those who conduct themselves as worthy members of the community are equally entitled to the protection of civil government. I hope ever to see America among the foremost nations in examples of justice and liberality. And I presume that your fellow citizens will not forget the patriotic part which you took in the accomplishment of their revolution and the establishment of their government, or the important assistance which they received from a nation in which the Roman Catholic faith is professed. He goes on a bit more and he closes this way. And may the members of your society in America, animated alone by the pure spirit of Christianity and still conducting themselves as the faithful subjects of our free government, enjoy every temporal and spiritual felicity. Thus, George Washington to the Catholics. In such accents as these, we can hear the unself-conscious belief on the part of our founders that what the visiting Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville would later call the spirit of liberty and the spirit of religion were not just fully compatible, but mutually reinforcing and indispensable to one another. Tocqueville, whose book perhaps you might have read in school, Democracy in America, Tocqueville wrote, despotism can do without faith, but freedom cannot. Precisely because a free society relies less on compulsion, permitting each person to chart his own course in life, religious faith is vitally important. Tocqueville said, where the political bond is relaxed, that is, where government relaxes and permits a freer society, the moral bond must be tightened. Tocqueville, himself a faithful Catholic, observed that his fellow Catholics in America were, quote, the most Republican and democratic class there is in the United States, small r, small d, the the most Republican and Democratic class there is in the United States. Catholicism, in Tocqueville's view, was favorable to democracy because its dogmas inclined people to see one another as equals. And in the American situation, in the 1830s, when Tocqueville was visiting and immigration was on the rise, Catholics were mostly poor and still a minority. And so they were naturally drawn, as he put it, to carry the idea of equality of conditions into the political world. What Tocqueville was observing a half century after our founding, in the contrast between America and his native France, returns us to an earlier point I made that I want to more fully develop now. That the Enlightenment was not a single thing, but multiple things, branches of modernity that took very different forms. The great intellectual historian Gertrude Himmelfarb wrote that there really were three Enlightenments: the British, the French, and the American. The French was the most radical in its egalitarianism, in its radical rejection of religion in the name of reason, and in its centralization of power in the state. The British was more conservative, dedicated to reforms that preserved what Himmelfarb calls the social virtues. But the American Revolution was the most dedicated to liberty, and at the same time, the most religious of the three. Catholicism was not outside the frame of this picture, but squarely inside it. In a fascinating recent book, Notre Dame theologian Ulrich Lehner has written of the Catholic Enlightenment, bringing to light forgotten currents of European thought in which Catholics argued for freedom, progress, and self-government. Now, let me fast forward to the middle of the 20th century. In the aftermath of the Second World War and the Holocaust, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The committee that produced that document included two notable Catholics, the Lebanese academic Charles Malik and the French philosopher Jacques Maritain. The resulting document, which speaks of equality, freedom, reason, and conscience, would have been impossible to conceive without the framework of Catholic ideas of natural law, subsidiarity, and solidarity. But it's also a very American document, whose model is obviously our Declaration of Independence, although it goes well beyond that model in its more detailed catalog of human rights. Perhaps inspired by these Catholic-inflected developments in world affairs, the American Jesuit priest John Courtney Murray published a book in 1960 whose title itself comes from the Declaration of Independence. We Hold These Truths was his title. His subtitle, Catholic Reflections on the American Proposition. Murray argued that the American creed and the political order based on it were fully consistent with Catholic natural law teaching. Paraphrasing Pope Pius XII, he wrote, "Government is not a judge of religious truth. Parliaments are not to play the theologian." Just a few years later, Father Murray from America would play a leading role in drafting Dignitatis Humanae, the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom. Here things get rather interesting. Father Murray, as a student of the American founding, was aware of a famous document from that period. He cites it in his book, written by James Madison, in a struggle in Virginia over religious freedom that took place in 1785. Titled Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, this pamphlet by Madison was a protest against the proposed law to use state funds to pay clergymen's salaries. Typical of Madison, he went all the way down to first principles to make his case, beginning with the argument that every person's religion must be, quote, left to the conviction and conscience of that person. This he called an unalienable right, echoing language of the Declaration of Independence. That means something inseparable from our being. Why? Why is freedom of conscience unalienable? Madison wrote, because the opinions of men, depending only on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men. And he said, Our right to religious freedom springs from our duty towards the Creator. Now, listen for the echoes of Madison 180 years later, at the Second Vatican Council, in the document Dignitatis Humanae that Father Murray played a part in drafting. Here's the Vatican Council Fathers. Men should act on their own judgment, enjoying and making use of a responsible freedom, not driven by coercion, but motivated by a sense of duty. It is upon the human conscience that these obligations fall and exert their binding force. The truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth, as it makes its entrance into the mind at once quietly and with power. James Madison, 1785, the Council Fathers, 1965, are both saying, in other words, that strictly speaking, coercion cannot generate authentic religious faith. The body may be compelled to bend, but the mind cannot be compelled to believe. James Madison was not, from all we know, a devout man. He was not as disdainful of traditional faith as his close friend Thomas Jefferson. Although Madison had studied theology at Princeton under its Calvinist president, John Witherspoon, staying an extra year after earning his degree, and so he is called around Princeton the university's first graduate student. At best, Madison was a casual Anglican. But here in 1785, in an argument that would be woven into Catholic doctrine almost 2 centuries later, he is making a case for religious freedom that is itself unmistakably Christian in origin. The great historian of Christianity, Robert Louis Wilken, Emeritus from the University of Virginia, in his book, Liberty and the Things of God, The Christian Origins of Religious Freedom, traces the Enlightenment doctrines of religious freedom not to secular modern philosophers who wanted allegedly to make men indifferent to faith, to tear down religion in general and Christianity in particular. No, he traces those doctrines of religious freedom to ancient Christian teachers and church fathers like Tertullian and Lactantius in the first few centuries of the Christian church. The works of these early Christians were known to thinkers like John Locke and to statesmen like Jefferson and Madison. And Tertullian and Lactantius were not anomalous figures in church history when they argued that, quote, it is not part of religion to coerce religious practice. That's Tertullian. And religion cannot be imposed by force. That's Lactantius. They're not outliers. They're echoing Peter and the apostles in Acts 5:29, when replying to the high priests who commanded them to cease their preaching. Did Peter and his fellow apostles say, we must obey God rather than men? The apostles were, of course, following the example of their master, who said, Mark 12:17, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. From the gospel to Acts, to the church fathers, to the doctrine of the 2 swords and freedom of the church in the Middle Ages, to the recognition in modern times of the freedom of conscience as an unalienable right at the foundation of a free society. Those very ideas at our founding of human equality, freedom, and limited government would never have borne the fruit we see in American society without the Christian and Catholic intellectual tradition supplying the argument. It was a natural development of Catholic doctrine to place religious liberty explicitly in the church's political and social teaching 6 decades ago. And it was an American priest who studied our founding who helped to get it done. Freedom and faith are interdependent. Each supports the other, and each is harmed in the other's absence. Bishop John Carroll knew this, as did his brother Daniel, who signed the Constitution, and his cousin Charles, who signed the Declaration. America's bishops today, I'm happy to say, appear to know it too. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops is all in on celebrating the semiquincentennial with a website of essays and reflections titled with that familiar American phrase, we hold these truths. You can look it up. It's linked on the USCCB website, or just Google Catholic bishops, we hold these truths. Like the Carrolls of the 18th century, like Father Michael McGivney, who founded the Knights of Columbus, our bishops know that no one has better cause than America's Catholics to say again, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you for listening this evening. Sure.
Anyone have any questions for Matt?
It's like my students. Somebody says something. Yes, sir.
Now, wouldn't you say that we have kind of reached, wouldn't you say that all of this great Catholic background has now reached a great apex where we have 6 Catholic Supreme Court justices and cabinet members that are Roman Catholic, and this Catholic faith has placed the Pope in the Vatican? All of this great Catholic foundation is in a sense leading the world now. And that's a result of our cultural and political and Catholic melding. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, you're singing from my hymnal, brother. I very much agree with that. Thank you, Jesus. I can remember when there was just one Catholic on the Supreme Court. In fact, for much of the 20th century, there was an unofficial Catholic seat on the Supreme Court. There was an unofficial Jewish seat.
Yeah.
And it was kind of expected that one of the seats would be filled by one of those minority communities. And now, right, there are 6 Catholics on the Supreme Court. And an American Pope. An American Pope who has spent most of his career outside the country as an Augustinian missionary, mostly in Peru, but a son of Chicago, and I'm sorry to say, a White Sox fan. I'm very heartened by. I wasn't expecting his election a year ago. I was thrilled and remain thrilled by his election as Supreme Pontiff of our church. I think he represents much that is great and good, not just about our church, but about our country. Yeah. My friend Peter.
Matthew, speaking of chairs, what do we know about what the Pope and the Chair of St. Peter and their position at the time of the founding of this country? What involvement did they have?
Yeah. I can't off the top of my head tell you who was Pope exactly. One of the Piuses, maybe the 6th or something. At the time of our founding, this was a very distant place from the perspective of Rome. John Carroll, our first bishop in this country, was actually elected bishop by his fellow priests, and then word was sent to Rome, this is the man we want, and the Holy Father blessed their choice, okay, which is really very unusual. That wouldn't happen today, right? But given the situation of America, so far from Europe, so hard to communicate rapidly, and the Catholic community being a minority, mostly concentrated in one of the states, Maryland, it just made sense. It just made sense for a choice to be made here by people close to the situation, and for Rome to ratify it. There was a period in the 18th century when the Jesuit order was actually suppressed by people who study Jesuit history will know this better than I, what the exact reasons were. I read it recently and I didn't retain all the details. But this was very upsetting to John Carroll and his fellow Jesuits in America. It sent Carroll into kind of a tailspin of depression. I mean, the suppression of the Jesuit order did not deprive him of his faculties as a priest or anything like that. But it was an unpleasant time for members of the order until a cloud was lifted from them some decades later. So the Supreme Pontiff's role in sort of fostering the faith in America was distant and indirect at best.
I have a question, Matt.
Yeah.
We know that one of the big black eyes, no pun intended, on our history is slavery.
Yes.
How were the American bishops and cardinals and Rome dealing with that? I've heard different things when I was in high school, but I'd rather hear from a scholar like you.
Yeah. I didn't see fit to bring this up, but I'm not whitewashing the history. But the Jesuits of the Maryland colony themselves owned slaves. And if you've followed any of the news in the last few years out of Georgetown University, they're trying to make reparations now. The university, which is a Jesuit university founded by John Carroll, right? They're trying to make reparations to the descendants of the slaves once held by the university. The college itself was the owner, apparently, of some of the slaves, or the order owned them, or individual priests owned them. So the Jesuits were complicit in slavery. That was just not unusual south of Mason-Dixon line for Christians of any description at that time. I wish I could say I know exactly when the Catholic bishops of the United States might have set their face against slavery. I'm not sure they ever did as a corporate body, right? As a conference, because by the time of the Civil War, there was a large concentration of Catholics in Louisiana. There was the old Maryland Catholic community, but then again, there were the hundreds of thousands of Irish and German immigrants, mostly concentrated in the north. And by this time they have their own bishops. I don't think that you can say much that is interesting either way about the Catholic role in the slavery issue as a church. Individuals were more or less complicit by virtue of their own situation and their own choices. Bishops, priests, Catholic lay people. Yeah. Maryland was founded as a tobacco state, as a tobacco colony, right? That was the cash crop. In fact, tobacco was the cash in which debts were paid for much of the 17th century colonial period. And that was a labor-intensive and slave-intensive form of agriculture in Maryland in the 17th and 18th centuries. Yeah. Great question.
Anyone else? Any questions? All right. Let's.
Deacon.
I could shout out.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you, Professor. Can you tell me, I just had this thought as we were talking, as you were talking. Catholics made incredible advances over time. of course, the Supreme Court you brought up. What did we surrender as Catholics in the form of tradition, the nature of how we practice, what we practice, to achieve this greater popularity within our country, a greater benefit, a greater experience among all the other organizations and peoples that were here? Did we surrender more than what we should have in the form of tradition? Or are we following a normal projectile here?
That's a really great question. The entire church, of course, went through the reforms and the aftermath of the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. Some of those changes for good, some of them for not so good, right? And there has been a tailing off in the practice of the faith, although it's worse in other historically Catholic countries like Italy and Ireland than it is here. In the 19th century, there was a priest named Father Isaac Hecker, who was the founder of the Paulist order. You've heard of the Paulists? They were founded here in this country as an order of priests by Father Hecker. Hecker was an avid exponent, in some respects, of sort of Americanizing the Catholic community in this country, accommodating American ways as much as possible. And he had thought this was a good road to proselytism as well, right? To the extent that the Catholics seemed to their neighbors less threatening, we would also be a more attractive field for conversion. After his death, a biography of Father Hecker came to the attention of Pope Leo XIII, who actually wrote a letter to Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore. Amounted to a kind of encyclical, but it was a letter intended to be distributed among Catholics and shared with the other bishops of the country. It had some Latin name like Ad Testem Benevolentiae or something like that. And in it, Pope Leo condemned a cluster of patterns he detected in the ministry of Father Hecker that he was worried were widespread in the United States, and he gave them a collective label, Americanism. This gave rise to a charge that there was such a thing as an Americanist heresy, or a heresy called Americanism. That, to me, goes a little far to say that is an actual heresy. But Pope Leo was worried about a real thing. He was worried about people not bringing up people intermarrying with folks from other churches and not bringing their kids up Catholic and that kind of thing, right? So, but there were things about Father Hecker that were not commonplace among American Catholics, and I think that, honestly, I think Pope Leo was overreacting a little bit to. There was certainly a Heckerism, but I'm not sure it was widespread Americanism. But the first two times there was a Catholic candidate for President of the United States, 1928 and 1960. Both those candidates, Al Smith, governor of New York in 28, and John F. Kennedy in 1960, faced the accusation that as Catholics, they couldn't be true blue Americans, or certainly not responsible American presidents, because they would, in the often whispered and sometimes shouted accusation, they would be taking orders from Rome, right? That guy with the Triple Crown in the Vatican. And so Smith and Kennedy were at great pains to establish to voters that they wouldn't be taking orders from the Pope. They would be their own men. Smith, I think, handled it better than Kennedy, but he lost. He lost to Herbert Hoover in 1928. Kennedy, some people read as having gone so far as as to promise to be indifferent to his faith in order to get elected. That may be unfair to him, but some of the things he said were a bit incautious. So, you know, we live in a pluralist society with a lot of Christians of other denominations. We have a church; they have denominations. But we have the church; they have denominations. But you know, while Catholics are the largest single church in the United States, that's a plurality. That's not a majority. We're outnumbered, just as we were at the American founding. And so it's a constant testing for us. You know, what I've said this evening is that faith and freedom are compatible. They're mutually interdependent. One cannot live without the other. But freedom is always also dangerous. All sorts of doors are open that we shouldn't be walking through, and that we should be reaching out and closing, right? And that's what we have to be mindful of while we say that opening prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance. Yeah.
Thank you.
Now we hear from the press. This will be the hard question.
Oh, well, no pressure. So you'd mentioned that it's unique to the American experience to have retained so many Catholics compared to other traditionally Catholic countries. What do you think is unique about our American environment, or what is causing that, in your opinion?
I'm not sure I said unique, and I don't think I would say unique,
Okay.
but we're doing better than some countries, and I named a couple where the church is much more beleaguered and the faith is even less commonly practiced than here. Among people who identify as Catholics and don't go to church, for instance, Ireland, Italy, they're in much worse shape. I think France is likewise, although the French are doing a little better than the Italians and Irish. But you know, the Poles, still a very Catholic country. I think Portugal, Spain, Slovakia, they're holding their own. Germany's a mess. But Germany is an interesting case because Germany has state support for churches. They have the thing that James Madison feared Virginia was about to do in 1785, with payments from the state treasury to churches to support ministry. German citizens pay a church tax. And it's so established in their law that if you wish to be relieved of that tax, you simply go to the church that the census has you identified with, and you tell them you want to leave. You deregister, as it were, right? You cancel your registration with your church, and your taxes go down. That's Germany. So, and the result is predictable, right? The faith is going like this, while the church rides on state revenues and keep the lights on. Keep the lights on over empty pews. So the German bishops do not feel much cause to worry about their finances. And it's shocking to me how little worried they are about the practice of the faith in the country. I think that that a large part of the American story is the freedom has lent itself to a more vigorous practice of the faith. And to a certain extent, that thing that Jefferson called separation of church and state has actually helped. I'm not fond of that phrase. It's not in the Constitution. But the expression, no, there shall be no law respecting an establishment of religion, that's in the First Amendment. The impossibility of a state establishment, as the Germans have, as even England has nominally, the Church of England, the monarch is the head of. We don't have that, and I think it's a positive for us. It's a plus for us. Ireland has flipped in a couple of generations from being one of the most Catholic countries in Europe to being one of the least Catholic countries where the state and the people in general are extremely hostile to the church today. And they did this after many centuries of oppression at the hands of the British, including the efforts since the 16th century to suppress Catholicism, right? Catholicism remained vibrant through all those centuries of oppression. Then, when they won their independence in the early 20th century as the Republic of Ireland, they put Catholicism in the constitution of the country. I think it's still there. There's a recognition that the Republic of Ireland is a nation under God. It's in the Constitution, and the Catholic Church is recognized as having a special place in Irish society. Okay, so you had this close relationship between state and church in Ireland, and it didn't serve them well. It didn't serve them well. When the scandals that have harmed the church everywhere came to light in Ireland, the reaction was even more extreme, because the close union of the church with the state meant that the entire establishment, the entire elite of the country was at fault. Not just some negligent bishops and some predatory priests. So we dodged that. Hello, Dorothy.
Hello. It's not a question, it's just my point of view.
Sure.
I think we Catholic has increased expansion after the Second Vatican Council, when they allow us to read the Bible, to discuss more, to these moments like Bible studies at night and things. That helps a lot.
Yeah.
It's not a question, it's just,
Yeah.
okay.
I agree with you. I mean, the joke, the standing joke we Catholics have with our Protestant friends is that if it's in the Bible, we'll ask them because they know it so much better. Right? Bible study, Bible preaching, long sermons, very much a normal part of evangelical Protestant life. We have our prayers, our rosaries, our devotions, the Mass, of course, the sacraments. But I do agree with you that the study of the faith was encouraged by the Second Vatican Council. The study of Scripture was encouraged, and the change of the Mass from Latin everywhere to the vernacular in each country. I have been to Latin Mass. It changed when I was so young. I really don't remember it from my childhood, but it was the norm when I was very small. I think it's a great thing, and I encourage people to experience if they haven't. And I respect and admire those people who want to make the Latin Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, a regular part of their worship. And I'm glad to see Pope Leo is relaxing some of the strictures on it that Pope Francis put in place. Because I think it's good to have the option, okay? But I like the vernacular Mass. I like being able to understand the Eucharistic prayers without having to remember my church Latin. That's a plus for me.
Yeah, can I add something?
Sure.
You know, there is a church in Allentown that is a Latin
Yes,
church,
St. John the Baptist.
Gregorian music.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add.
Yes, I once went to a Latin Mass wedding at St. John the Baptist in Allentown. It was beautiful. Yeah, it's really. I once went to a Latin Mass wedding in the Princeton Chapel, which would make the Presbyterian founders of Princeton University spin in their graves. But the chapel there is. I should say this: the current chaplain and the last several chaplains at Princeton University, where I still do some teaching part-time, have really been great at community building with the Catholic youngsters. And there's during the semester, there's daily Mass at noon in the Princeton Chapel.
Wow.
And there's 2 Sunday Masses and a very active Catholic community of students there. And I think on balance, the Council Fathers of 1965 or so, I think they pointed the church in the right direction. But I do think that there are some things that some bishops, some priests, some theologians took as a signal for changes not contemplated by the Council Fathers that were too rapidly adopted, and some of those need to be rethought. Yeah.
All right, well, let's have a nice warm hand for Matt. Marie, can you hand me that piece of paper? I forgot to bring it. Sorry.
Any of that cake left?
Just want to make 2 closing announcements. This summer, we're having the Emmaus Journey. For those who don't know what that is reflections and discussions on the Sunday readings for the upcoming Mass. There'll be announcements in the bulletin. We're only having a morning session if we do have it, so keep your eye on the bulletin over the next few weeks. This Monday, the parish is marching in the Memorial Day Parade, so check the website if you wish to sign up and march with us. And everyone have a great evening. Thank you.